The autumn wind came early to the Powder River country that year, sliding down off the mountains with a cold edge that made the cottonwoods shiver before September had even finished its first week. Out along the rutted wagon road that cut between Clearwater Creek and the little settlement folks were starting to call Mill Haven, a woman walked with her skirt pressed flat against her legs by the gusting air, a cracked leather coin purse clutched in both hands like it held something sacred. She was 31 years old, lean from honest work, with dark eyes that never quite stopped moving, reading the sky, the soil, the faces of people she passed. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, tales of resilient women, ingenious farmers, and the quiet triumphs that built this nation from the soil up. Today we follow Sarah as she makes a decision that seemed foolish to every practical eye in Mill Haven, but which would plant the seeds of a legacy none could have foreseen. Her husband was 34, a quiet man who had come home from the war 4 years prior, missing 2 fingers from his left hand, and carrying something heavier than missing fingers inside his chest. He was good with wood and good with silence. In the 2 years since they had filed on their homestead parcel north of the creek, he had built her a solid cabin, a passable barn, and a fence that actually kept the wind from feeling so personal. What he had not been able to build yet was enough. Enough flour, enough seed stock for spring, enough of anything that turns a claim into a life rather than just a survival. She had 12 cents in the coin purse. She had walked the 3 miles to Mill Haven because she had heard from the woman at the dry goods counter, who heard it from the freighter who passed through Tuesdays, that old Harkin over on the South Pasture Road was trying to rid himself of his entire chicken flock before the hard freeze came. Harkin had taken sick. His wife had gone back to her sister in Nebraska, and the man wanted the animals gone more than he wanted fair money for them. She stepped off the main road and down the side track toward Harkin's place before she let herself think too carefully about what she was doing. Thinking too carefully had a way of making the impossible stay impossible. Harkin met her at his gate with suspicious eyes and muddy boots. Behind him, scratching and stumbling around the bare dirt yard, was the most pitiful collection of poultry she had ever seen. 11 chickens in various states of dishevelment. Patchy feathers, crooked toes, one hen with a wing that drooped at an odd angle, another with a bald patch the size of a man's palm across her back. 2 of the roosters were so thin she could nearly count their ribs through the skin. "I've got 12 cents, she said, meeting his eyes without apology. "And I will take every bird you have." Harkin stared at her. Then he looked back at his yard full of crooked, limping, half-feathered birds that not a single sensible person in the county had offered him a coin for. He looked at her coin purse. He looked at the sky going gray and cold above them. "Done," he said. She counted the coins into his rough palm and watched his fingers close around them without ceremony. All 12 cents. Everything she had left after flour and salt and the single small candle she allowed herself each week. She did not let herself feel the weight of that until later. Getting 11 half-wild, half-miserable chickens down the road to her own claim was its own kind of trial. She had brought a length of burlap sacking folded under her arm, and she fashioned it into a loose bundle, coaxing the birds in 2 at a time, tucking them against her side, carrying what she could, and herding the rest ahead of her with a green willow switch she cut from the ditch bank. The droopy-winged hen she carried separately, cradled against her chest like something fragile, because she suspected the wing had been stepped on and not broken clean, and she wanted to see for herself before she made any judgments. The sky was the color of pewter by the time she turned up the packed dirt path toward the cabin. The wind had teeth in it now, cutting low across the prairie grass. She could see the thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney. Thomas had come home from the Miller claim before her and had a fire going, which meant supper would not be entirely her burden tonight. She heard him before she reached the door. He had stepped outside to work the pump handle and stopped when he saw her coming up the path with 11 ragged chickens orbiting her like small disorganized planets. He said nothing for a moment. She kept walking. "Harkin's birds," he said, not a question exactly. "They were available," she replied. He looked at the droopy-winged hen tucked against her coat. Then he looked at the thin roosters pecking experimentally at the frozen grass near the fence post. He looked at the bald-backed hen who had already wandered sideways into the gate and stood blinking at it with mild confusion. 12 cents, she said before he could speak. He turned his head slightly, the way he did when he was weighing something without wanting to show which direction the scale was tipping. Then he said, "The pen is not finished." "I know. The wind is coming from the north tonight." "I know that too." He set down the water bucket. He did not argue, did not list the reasons this was unlikely to work, did not remind her of what 12 cents represented to them in December of 1878. He simply picked up the hammer he had left leaning against the fence post that morning and walked toward the half-built chicken pen without another word. She stood watching him go, the droopy hen warm against her coat, the others scratching fitfully at the cold ground around her boots. Something settled in her chest. Not certainty, not yet, but the particular feeling that came when two people decided to try the same impossible thing at the same moment. She carried the wing-hurt hen inside first, out of the wind. The wind came exactly when she said it would. By the time the last nail was driven and the pen gate latch shut, the north had pushed a hard, flat cold across the yard that turned the mud to iron underfoot. Thomas came inside, smelling of pine resin and cold air, his knuckles red, and she handed him the tin cup she had already filled and waiting near the stove. He took it without a word and stood close to the heat. And for a few minutes, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing urgent left to say. Only the sound of the wind working at the corner of the cabin and the low clucking coming from the pen outside, which they could hear faintly if the stove popped quiet for a moment. She had spread ash from the firebox along the floor of the pen before nightfall. Not a thick bed, they could not spare much, but a shallow layer scraped from the bottom drawer of the stove box, still warm at the edges, laid down close to the south-facing wall where the boards blocked most of the wind. She had read once, in a folded page torn from an almanac her mother had carried west, that wood ash kept the ground from drawing cold upward through small creatures. She did not know if this was entirely true, but she knew ash held warmth the way clay held water, and she had nothing else to offer them but what she already had. The 11 birds were not good birds. She knew this plainly. 3 of them could not roost correctly because their feet would not grip, and they slept pressed flat against each other in a corner like a single rumpled thing. The wing-hurt hen she had brought inside and settled into the ash box near the stove's lower draft, wrapped in a strip of old feed sack. It had stopped trembling by supper. Thomas sat down at the table after a while and looked at the small shape of the hen bundled in the corner. He said, "You know what the Aldens said when they saw you leading them up the road?" "Yes." He turned the cup in his hands. "Delbert Marsh laughed loud enough I heard it from the well." "I heard it too." He looked at her. "Does that bother you?" She considered this honestly, the way she always considered his questions, which was one of the things he had learned to depend on in her. Then she said, "It would bother me more to let them die in Harkin's yard for not being worth his trouble." He set the cup down and looked at the table for a moment. "What do they eat?" It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man beginning to plan. She pulled the small piece of paper from her apron pocket, the one she had been adding to since midday, and smoothed it flat on the table between them. Corn mash, prairie thyme if the frost hadn't taken it, warm water twice a day. He leaned forward and read it carefully, and she watched his face change. He read it twice. Then he reached past her hand and tapped the line about the prairie thyme. "I saw some near the lower fence, east side, below the rise. It was still green 2 days ago." She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. She had been afraid he would read the list the way a cautious man reads a bill he cannot pay, looking for what it would cost rather than what it might do. But he was not reading it that way. He was reading it the way he read a plot of ground before turning it, looking for what was already there. She said, "The ash from the stove. I want to make a bed of it in the corner of the lean-to, deep enough to hold warmth through the night." He thought about this. She could see him turning it in his mind the way he turned most things, quietly and without hurry. "I'll bank the stove hotter before bed," he said. "We'll have good ash by morning." She nodded and wrote that down at the bottom of the paper, though she would not have forgotten it. They talked for a while longer at the table, the lamp between them making a small, warm country of its own against the dark outside. He asked how many birds she thought were strong enough to eat on their own, and how many would need the mash thinned with extra water. She told him she thought 4 were in poor enough shape that she would feed them separately from the others, at least for the first week. He asked about the one with the twisted foot. She said she wasn't certain about that one yet. He said he would look at the foot in the morning. He had seen a similar thing in a calf once, and there had been a way to ease it with a cloth wrap changed daily. She had not known that. She wrote it down. This was the way they had always worked, the two of them. And she thought sometimes that it was the most useful thing about their life together. Not the land or the cabin or anything they had built with their hands, but this habit of sitting at a table and thinking a problem through until it became smaller than it had first appeared. They had done it with the failed well, with a hard winter 2 years back, with the fence that kept coming down along the north pasture. They had done it so many times it had its own feeling now, like a tool worn smooth in a familiar place. Outside, the wind came up briefly and then quieted. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket, and he stood and carried the cups to the basin. Then he pulled on his coat and went out to check the lean-to once more before they slept. And she stayed at the table a moment, listening to his boots cross the yard, thinking about the ash bed and the prairie thyme and the small pale hen in the corner. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. She did not sleep well that first night, and she knew why. It was not the wind, which had settled, nor the cold, which was no worse than any other night that week. It was the small, pale hen. She had placed it in the corner of the lean-to, separated from the others by a low partition of stacked wood her husband had helped her arrange before dark. She had packed warm ash around the nesting hollow and laid a strip of old canvas over the top to hold the heat. She had done what she could. But something in the way the bird had sat, too still, too quiet, watching her with one yellow eye as she moved around it. That image stayed with her as she lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the yard. Before first light, she was up. The lean-to was cold at the edges but warmer near the center where the ash had held. She crouched beside the partition and set her lantern down. The pale hen lifted its head and looked at her. It had not moved from where she had placed it, but it had eaten. The small dish of soaked corn mash she had left was empty, scraped clean. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath she had been holding longer than she realized. Thomas found her there when he came out to start his morning work. He did not say anything for a moment, just looked at the empty dish, then at the bird, then at her. "She ate," he said, "every bit of it." He nodded slowly in the way he had that meant he was adjusting some quiet calculation inside himself. He had been more doubtful than he let on, she knew that. He had helped her without question, because that was the kind of man he was. But she had seen the careful way he measured his optimism, like a man rationing flour in a lean month. She mixed a second mash that morning, a little thicker, with dried prairie thyme crumbled in, and a pinch of the coarse salt she used sparingly. She had read somewhere, she could not now remember where, that herbs helped birds settle their digestion, and she had no reason to disbelieve it. She carried it to each of the dividing sections she had made in the lean-to, checking the ash beds for warmth, shaking the damp ones loose and replacing them with dry. The other birds were restless that morning. They pecked and shifted, feathers puffed against the chill. But they were eating too, all of them, even the worst of the lot, the one with the crooked leg that she had watched try 3 times to reach the dish before it finally managed. She spent 2 hours with them before the sun was properly up. When she came back inside, Thomas already had the fire going and the coffee on. She sat down at the table and spread her folded notes in front of her, adding to the column she had started the night before. The column had 3 headings: cost, condition, change. She had written them small, in the way a woman writes when she knows paper is not cheap, leaving room for many rows below. Under cost, she had listed what she had spent: the coins for the birds, the dried corn, the salt, the small bundle of thyme she had traded a jar of pickled beets to get from the mercantile. Under condition, she had made her notes in plain language, no sentiment in it, the way a farmer might assess a field: which bird stood straight, which favored a side, which had bare patches and where. Under change, she had written what she had seen shift in the past days, however small. She was not romantic about it. She was measuring. Thomas set her coffee beside her without being asked and leaned over to look at the page, not reading it aloud, just looking, the way a man looks at something his wife has made that he finds quietly extraordinary. He did not say anything. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder and then went to turn the bacon. The column was short still, only 4 days of entries. But even in 4 days, there was something to see if you looked for it. 2 of the worst birds were taking feed more steadily, and one of the bare-patched ones along the spine had, she was almost certain, a faint new growth coming in. You could not prove it from a distance. You had to hold the bird, tip it gently in the light, and look close. She had done exactly that, standing in the lean-to at dawn, with cold fingers and her breath making small clouds. The neighbors would have called that foolishness. She understood their arithmetic. A sick chicken cost more to feed than it would ever return. And time spent on a failing animal was time taken from something that might actually survive. That was plain frontier math, and it was not wrong. But it assumed you were starting with something healthy and had a choice. She had started with what she could afford, which was nothing anyone else wanted. And so her arithmetic had to run a different direction. She finished her coffee and refilled it without asking herself whether she had earned a second cup. She had been up since before the light. What she was building, she had decided, was not just flock recovery. It was a system. Each step, the ash warmth, the mash thickness, the herbs, the divisions in the lean-to to let the calmer birds settle without the anxious ones wearing them down, each step fed the next. You could not do only one of them and expect the whole thing to hold. It was like a fence. Every post mattered. She was on the 4th entry in the change column when Thomas said quietly from the stove that he thought the spotted one had stood taller that morning. He had noticed. She had not told him to look. The spotted one had stood taller. It was a small thing to say aloud, and he had said it the way a man says something he has been turning over privately for a while, testing whether it sounded foolish before he let it out. It did not sound foolish. She added a second note beside the first, underlining it once, because underlines in her ledger meant she believed it enough to stake something on it. By the end of that week, she had separated the flock into 3 distinct groups. It had taken her 2 evenings, and a length of salvaged wire her husband had pulled from a collapsed fence post on the eastern edge of their claim. The wire was rusty in places and would not have held a determined dog, but it did not need to. It only needed to hold chickens. And chickens, she had learned, respected a barrier more for the idea of it than for its actual strength. The anxious birds went nearest the lean-to wall, where the residual warmth from the ash beds carried longest into the night. The recovering birds went in the middle section, with fresh straw and a shallow dish of mash thickened with dried prairie clover she had hung in bundles from the cabin eaves in September. The steadiest birds, the 3 who had begun to look almost dignified despite their ragged feathers, went in the outermost section, where they could see the yard and hear the ordinary sounds of morning without anything crowding them. Thomas watched the arrangement go up without commenting on whether it would work. That was a form of faith she appreciated more than reassurance. He did ask on the 3rd evening where she had learned that clover settled a nervous stomach in livestock. She told him she had not learned it anywhere in particular. She had thought about what made her own stomach easier when it troubled her. Warm, mild things, nothing sharp. And she had reasoned that a hen's system was probably not so different in its preferences, even if it was different in its workings. He nodded as though this were a sound method of research, which she supposed it was. The mash she adjusted every other day, not dramatically. A little more ground corn when a bird seemed thin. A little more water when the air inside the lean-to was drying out from the cold pressing against the boards. She kept her notes. The change column was filling faster than the others now, which meant things were moving in a direction she could track. What she had not expected was how much she would come to know each bird individually. Not as pets, she was too practical for that. And the whole point of the exercise was eventual supper, eventual coin, eventual something more than surviving the month. But as subjects, the way a careful person knows the particular character of each tool in a workshop. This one favored the left side of the dish. That one ate last, but ate most thoroughly. The spotted one, true to her husband's early observation, had become the quiet center of the middle group without seeming to try. She wrote that down too. Winter deepened the way it does on the Nebraska plain, not all at once, but by slow degrees. Each morning a little harder, each evening a little longer in the dark. She had strung a second rope of dried prairie grass along the lean-to's inner wall to cut the draft, and he had banked a low berm of sod against the outside boards one Saturday afternoon without her asking. She noticed. She said nothing about it directly, only made sure his coffee was hotter than usual that evening, and set it beside him without comment. That was their language sometimes, small and sufficient. The birds were changing, not dramatically, not in ways the neighbors who still passed remarks from the road would have recognized or credited. But she saw it in her ledger. The weight column was moving. The spotted one had put on enough that she had to adjust her estimate of the others upward. If he was gaining at that rate on winter rations, the leaner birds were likely performing better than their frame suggested. She wrote a note in the margin. Do not judge by frame alone. Output is the measure. She had begun experimenting with the herb preparations in smaller ways. Dried goldenrod steeped in warm water and worked into the mash on alternating days. A small amount of rendered lard stirred in when the cold was sharpest. For the fat, the birds were burning just to stay warm. She had no way to know which of these choices mattered and which were simply comfort offered to creatures who could not ask for it. But she kept the record honest, noting what she changed and when, so that if something improved or faltered, she would have a trail to follow back. Thomas had taken to stopping at the lean-to on his way from the barn each evening, just briefly. Not to check her work, he was wise enough not to frame it that way, but to report what he had observed from his angle. One evening he mentioned that the 3 birds near the east wall were moving more freely than when they had arrived, their gait less effortful. She hadn't been able to see that from where she knelt to fill the dish, and she was grateful he had. What she was building, she was beginning to understand, was not just a healthier flock. It was a repeatable, observable, adjustable system that lived in the pages of that small book as surely as it lived in the bodies of the birds. If it worked, she would know why it worked. And knowing why was the difference between luck and skill. Luck couldn't be sold. Skill could. She set the ledger on the shelf above the stove that night where the warmth would keep the ink from stiffening in the cold, and stood for a moment looking at the cover. 22 birds. 83 days of record. Something was accumulating in those pages that she had not quite had a word for yet, but she was getting close. The word, when it finally came to her, arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was crumbling dried yarrow into the corn mash. Proof. That was what was accumulating in the ledger, not hope, not guesswork, not the kind of stubborn faith that could be dismissed as a woman who didn't know better, but the kind of proof that sat still and let itself be examined, that didn't require her to raise her voice or defend herself at the feed store, the kind that would eventually speak for itself in a language even skeptics understood. She folded the yarrow in slowly, watching the pale green flecks disappear into the yellow of the mash, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long while. He came in from splitting wood before the cold deepened, stomping the mud from his boots at the threshold, and she handed him the warm mug of chicory without being asked. He took it the way he always took things from her hands, with a small, deliberate attention, as if receiving it mattered. They had built that habit without naming it, the way they had built most things. Still, 3 of the Rhode Island birds are putting on weight, he said, wrapping both hands around the mug. You can feel it when you lift them. They're not fighting it anymore. She nodded. She had noticed their feathers filling in along the back and breast, the fine, close growth that came when a bird stopped spending all its energy on staying alive and had a little left over for something better. That was the threshold. Once a bird crossed it, the change accelerated. She had seen it now enough times to trust it. What she had not told him yet, because she was still turning it over, making sure the thought was solid before she gave it weight in the air between them, was that she had begun to believe the mash was doing something beyond simple nourishment. The herbs were altering something in the flavor of the birds themselves, or would, given time. She had no scientific word for it, but she had memory. She remembered the difference between the pale, thin chickens her mother had kept on grain alone and the birds her grandmother had ranged through a garden thick with sage and chamomile and bitter greens. There was a richness to the latter that went all the way through the meat, a depth that plain feed simply could not produce. She believed she was growing that depth, slowly, deliberately, the way everything worth having on the frontier was grown, against difficulty, without guarantee, in the faith that careful work compounded. "Come spring," she said, setting her own mug down and reaching again for the ledger. "I want to try the first one." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "The first what?" "The first bird for the table. I want to know what we've actually made." He set his cup down slowly, the way a man does when something unexpected has entered the room without knocking. She tapped the ledger page where she had been tracking weights, each bird's condition at purchase, each week's feeding record. The cost of the grain and dried herbs tallied against what she had spent. It was not a large book, but she had used it carefully, the columns tight and without waste, the same way she had used everything else since they had first broken ground on this claim. "Bess," she said, drawing a small circle around one entry. The name she had given the first hen she had nursed through the broken feathering. "She is the heaviest now, and her comb is bright. Another 3 weeks, and she will be at her best. I want a fryer." He was quiet, not disagreeing, she could tell. Thinking. "You named her," he said finally. "I name all of them. That does not mean I have forgotten what they are." He nodded slowly, conceding the point. She had grown up on a farm. She understood the contract between a woman and her animals better than most men who had only ever seen livestock from horseback. The naming was practical. It kept the record straight in her mind. Not sentimental in the way he was imagining. Outside, the late winter wind pressed against the south wall of the cabin with a low, even sound, like someone leaning their whole weight against a door. The fire in the stove held steady. She had banked it well that evening. "What do you think you'll find?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I think I will find that the mash and the herbs have done what I believe they have done. I think the meat will be different than anything we have eaten from an ordinary yard bird." She paused. "But I won't know until I know." He was quiet again, and she appreciated that about him. He did not rush to fill silence with skepticism he had not earned, nor with encouragement that cost him nothing. He sat with what she said and waited, the same way she weighed everything. "And if you are right?" he asked. "Then we try 2 birds in late April, and we invite someone." "Who?" She looked at the fire rather than at him. "Somebody whose opinion carries weight in town. Someone people listen to." He thought for a moment. "The miller's wife." "Yes." He reached across the table and turned the ledger so he could see the columns for himself. His finger moved down the page without speaking, reading the numbers the way he read the land, looking for what they told him beneath the surface. 3 more weeks, he said. 3 more weeks, she agreed. She closed the book gently and set it beside the lamp. The wind pressed again against the wall, and neither of them spoke. But between them the quiet held something warmer than silence. The 3 weeks passed the way difficult things always pass on the frontier, not quickly but completely. She tended the 2 birds she had chosen with the same deliberate attention she had given the whole flock through the long winter months, but with a sharper eye now. She watched the way they moved through the yard in the pale morning light, their feathers grown in thick and unmarked, their steps unhurried and confident. They had come so far from what they were. She thought about that sometimes when she stood at the fence with her arms folded against the cold. How far anything could come, given warmth and time and something worth eating. Thomas split extra firewood that 3rd week without being asked. She noticed and said nothing because some things were better honored by noticing than by speaking. On a Thursday morning, when the sky had cleared to a clean and certain blue, she made her decision. She told him before breakfast, and he set down his coffee and nodded once. That afternoon he rode into town and came back with word that Mrs. Whitcomb, the miller's wife, would come on Saturday, and that she had said yes, without hesitation, in the way that people say yes when they are curious but do not want to appear so. Saturday arrived cold and still. She began before the light was fully up. She had thought through every step in the days before, the way she always planned, turning each stage over in her mind until she could see it clearly. The birds she had processed the evening before and kept cool in the root cellar. She had prepared her seasoned coating the night before as well, ground fine with the stone mortar. The dried herbs she had gathered and hung from the rafters last autumn, pressed into the flour until it smelled of something almost herbal and deep and clean. The cast-iron skillet had belonged to her mother, and she treated it accordingly. She rendered the fat slowly over a careful fire, watching the temperature with the patience she had learned from the chickens themselves. That nothing worth having responds well to rushing. When the coating went on, it went on with her hands, pressing it gently, thoroughly, into every fold and surface. Thomas stayed out of the kitchen. She had not asked him to, but he understood without being told. He brought in wood twice, set it quietly by the door, and each time he glanced at the skillet, the way a man looks at something he knows is beyond his part in the story. When the first pieces came out of the iron and she set them on the cloth to rest, the smell filled every corner of the cabin immediately and completely. Something rich and savory and golden, and unlike anything she had produced before. She stood back from the stove and looked at what was in front of her. She heard his boots stop moving in the other room. He appeared in the doorway without a word, hat still in hand from where he had been turning it over and over without realizing it. She did not look up immediately. She was still watching the pieces the way a person watches something they have waited a long time to see, quietly, without wanting to disturb it. Then she lifted one piece and held it toward him. He took it carefully, the way you take something you understand has cost more than money. He bit into it, and the sound of it was crisp and clean in the small cabin. And then he was still. And she watched his face do the thing faces do when something exceeds what they had prepared themselves to feel. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. He looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. He said it was the best thing he had ever eaten. She laughed, a short, surprised sound, almost like relief. And then she turned back to the skillet, because there was still work to do, and because she was not quite ready to let herself feel the full weight of it yet. Mrs. Whitcomb arrived at midday, driving a neat buggy with a matching brown mare that looked better fed than half the livestock in Millhaven. She was a woman of about 50, with silver-streaked hair pinned tight beneath a good bonnet, and eyes that had seen enough seasons to recognize quality when it crossed her path. She stepped down from the buggy without waiting for assistance, smoothed her skirt, and looked at the cabin, the yard, the lean-to with the low chicken fence, with the same measured attention she might give a piece of machinery she was considering purchasing. Sarah met her at the door. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Whitcomb." The miller's wife inclined her head. "I was curious," she said, which was truer than she probably meant to let on. They ate at the small table near the stove, the three of them, and for a few minutes there was nothing but the sound of forks against tin plates and the occasional crackle of the fire. Mrs. Whitcomb took her first bite of the chicken slowly, the way a cautious person takes the first sip of a hot drink, testing, evaluating. She chewed. She set her fork down. She picked it up again. She took another bite, larger this time, and then she looked at Sarah with an expression that shifted from curiosity to something closer to wonder. "What did you do to this bird?" she asked. Sarah told her, not everything. She was not foolish enough to give away the full recipe to the first person who asked. But she described the herbs, the mash, the careful feeding schedule, the separation of the flock by temperament and health. She spoke plainly, the way she kept her ledger, without embellishment, without apology. Mrs. Whitcomb listened without interrupting, and when Sarah finished, the miller's wife sat back in her chair and looked at her for a long, silent moment. "I have been eating chicken for 47 years, she said finally. "I have never tasted anything like this." She leaned forward again and pointed at the remaining piece on the plate. "May I take this home to my husband?" Sarah nodded. Mrs. Whitcomb wrapped the piece in clean cloth and placed it in her basket with the same care Sarah herself had used when carrying the wing-hurt hen home from Harkin's yard. At the door she turned. "I will speak of this," she said, and that was all. But it was enough. By the following Saturday, word had moved the way it always moves in country like that, quietly and then all at once. Sarah set out a cloth-covered board near the road with nothing written on it, because nothing needed to be written. The first neighbor arrived before she expected, carrying a clean pail and a slightly embarrassed expression. Then two more came up the road together, talking about something else and pretending that was why they had come that direction. Thomas stood near the fence and did not say a single thing about the fact that these were the same people who had stood in his yard not many months before and told his wife plainly that she was throwing good money away on lame, half-bald birds. Sarah did not say it either. She just filled the pail and named the price with a steadiness that surprised even her. The neighbor paid it without hesitation. By noon, the board was empty. By afternoon, there was talk of the following week. That evening, they sat on the step together after the work was done, and the chickens were settled behind their pen fence, and the prairie light was going long and gold across the grass. Thomas had his coffee. Sarah had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance where the land rolled away toward the creek. He said he had never doubted her. She said that was generous of him, given everything. He said it wasn't generous, it was just true. She looked over at him then, and he looked at her, and between them passed the kind of understanding that does not require language. The kind that is built from shared cold mornings and shared failures and shared stubborn, patient hope. The chickens moved in the dark behind the fence, soft and content. The land held them both, and they had earned it. But the frontier is not kind to the person who finds a small success. It tests that person to see whether the success was accident or character. And Millhaven, being what it was, had its own way of administering that test. It started with Delbert Marsh, the man who had laughed loud enough for Thomas to hear it from the well. Delbert Marsh was a large man with a red face and a voice that carried across fields whether he meant it to or not. He owned the largest spread in the county, 160 acres of good bottomland that had come to him through a government claim he had filed before the war, back when a man could still take the best ground without competition. He had never liked Thomas, for reasons that had more to do with the quiet way Thomas carried himself than anything Thomas had ever done or said. And he had never liked Sarah because she did not flinch when he spoke loud. The week after Mrs. Whitcomb's visit, Delbert Marsh appeared at the edge of their property line with a bucket of feed in one hand and a smirk that could be heard from 40 yards. He called out that he had heard about their special chickens and wanted to see for himself what all the fuss was about. Sarah came to the fence and met him there. She did not invite him in. He stood on the other side of the wire and looked at the pen, at the birds moving inside it, at the neat divisions she had made, and the ash beds she still maintained even as spring approached. He said they looked like ordinary chickens to him. She said they were. He said he had heard she was feeding them something fancy. She said she was feeding them what they needed. He laughed then, the same loud laugh Thomas had heard from the well, and said that in his experience a chicken was a chicken, and no amount of herbs or fussing would change what ended up on the plate. He said he had been raising birds for 20 years and had never needed to read a book or keep a ledger to produce a decent meal. He said it loud enough that the sound carried to the cabin, where Thomas was working on a harness repair near the door, and stopped to listen. Sarah did not respond to the laugh. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Delbert Marsh with the same patient attention she gave her chickens when they were being difficult, and said that she wished him a good afternoon. He stood there a moment longer, the bucket in his hand, the smirk still on his face, but the laugh had stopped. And then he turned and walked back toward his land, and Sarah went back to her work. But she felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders like a cold mist that would not burn off until the sun was higher. The mockery came in small doses after that, the way prairie rain comes, not all at once, but persistent enough to soak through. A remark at the Mercantile about fancy hen-keeping. A snicker from the Alden boys when they saw her carrying her mash pail to the pen. A comment from the feed store clerk, who had heard from someone who had heard from someone that Sarah Whitaker thought she knew more about poultry than people who had been doing it their whole lives. She heard it all. The walls of the cabin were thin, and the prairie carried sound the way water carries light. But she did not stop. She could not stop, because the ledger was filling, and the numbers in the change column were climbing faster than the numbers in the cost column, and she was beginning to see a pattern emerge that was larger than any single bird or any single season. The herbs were not just improving the flavor, they were improving the health. The birds that had access to the dried prairie clover and the goldenrod and the thyme were showing fewer signs of the respiratory troubles that plagued ordinary flocks in the damp spring months. Their combs were brighter. Their feathers came in faster after molting. Their eggs, when she began to collect them from the 2 layers that had finally started producing, had yolks of a deeper orange than any egg she had ever cracked. She did not have the language of a scientist to explain this, but she had the evidence of her own eyes and her own ledger, and she trusted that more than she trusted any man's opinion, no matter how loudly delivered. Thomas watched her work and said little, but she noticed he had started keeping a small notebook of his own, observations about the pasture conditions, about the quality of the well water, about which areas of the claim seemed to hold warmth longest after sunset. He never showed it to her, and she never asked to see it. But she knew what it meant. He was beginning to believe that what she was doing was not a single trick, but a system, and that a system could be learned and taught and passed on. Spring came reluctantly that year, as though it was not sure the winter had really ended. The snow melted in patches, leaving the ground soft and treacherous. The creek rose and then fell again. The prairie greened in slow stages, first the low places, then the slopes. Sarah expanded her flock by 7 birds. Pullets she bought from a widow on the other side of Millhaven who was giving up her homestead and selling everything she could not carry. The widow had asked about the chicken business, and Sarah had told her the truth, that she was building something, that it was slow work, that the mockery was constant but manageable. The widow had looked at her with tired eyes and said that mockery was easier to bear than hunger. She had sold Sarah the pullets for half what they were worth, and Sarah had taken them without argument. That was the thing about the frontier. It sorted people into those who helped each other through the hard times and those who only watched and waited for the hard times to break someone. Sarah was learning which kind of person she wanted to be. She added the pullets to her rotation, keeping them separate at first the way she had with the first birds, until she could assess their temperaments and their health. She noted everything. The widow's birds were younger and in better condition than Harkin's had been, but they had been fed on plain corn and water, and their feathers lacked the luster she was beginning to expect from her own flock. She adjusted their mash gradually, introducing the herbs in small amounts so as not to startle their systems. She watched, she waited, she wrote, and the mockery continued. Delbert Marsh took to stopping at the fence line whenever he passed, not to speak, but to stand and look, and sometimes shake his head slowly, as though observing a curiosity he could not quite understand. The Alden boys made a game of walking past the pen and making chicken noises, flapping their arms, calling out that the Whitaker hen house smelled like a medicine shop. Sarah heard them from the cabin and did not go to the door. She had learned that the mockery fed on attention the way a fire fed on dry grass. If she did not give it fuel, it would burn itself out eventually. But it did not burn out. It spread. By late April, there was talk in Millhaven that Sarah Whitaker's chickens were a waste of time and money, that she was neglecting her other duties to fuss over a flock of birds that would never amount to anything, that her husband was too soft to put a stop to it. The talk reached her at the Mercantile one Tuesday afternoon, when she went to buy salt and found the clerk unwilling to meet her eyes. She paid for her goods and left without asking what was wrong. She did not need to ask. She could feel the shape of the gossip in the air the way you can feel a storm coming before you see the clouds. She walked home with the salt in her basket and the weight of the town's opinion pressing against her back, and she did not let her pace slow until she reached the gate of her own claim. Inside the cabin, she set the basket on the table and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Then she went to the ledger and opened it to the page where she had recorded the results of Mrs. Whitcomb's visit, the price the first neighbor had paid without hesitation, the growing list of names of people who had come to the board and left with her birds. She read each entry slowly, the way a person reads a letter from someone they trust. And then she closed the book and went out to check the pullets, because the chickens did not care what Millhaven thought of her, and that was one of the reasons she had come to love them. But the storm was not finished gathering. A week later, at the end of April, a cold front dropped out of the north and settled over the prairie with a stillness that felt wrong. The sky turned the color of old iron. The temperature fell faster than it should have for that time of year, and by nightfall there was frost forming on the grass. a late-season freeze that caught every farmer in the county unprepared. Sarah and Thomas worked through the evening and into the dark, carrying extra straw to the lean-to, banking the stove higher, rigging canvas over the pen to hold the warmth. She brought the youngest pullets inside the cabin, into the ash box near the fire, the same way she had brought the wing-hurt hen months before. They sat up past midnight, listening to the wind and the creak of the boards, and Sarah held her ledger in her lap and read the entries by lamplight, searching for something she had done in the winter that she could repeat now. The frost held for 3 nights. On the 3rd morning, she walked out to the pen with her heart low in her chest and found all but 2 of her birds alive, puffed up and irritable, but breathing. The 2 that had died were the ones she had not yet transitioned fully to her feeding system, the ones still eating the plain corn the widow had given them. She buried them near the fence line and stood for a long moment with her hands folded, not praying exactly, but thinking. The frost had tested her. The system had held. And when Delbert Marsh rode past that afternoon and saw her standing by the grave of 2 small birds, he called out that maybe she would listen to sense now, that maybe she would stop wasting her time on foolishness and do what everyone else did. She did not answer him. She walked back to the lean-to and mixed a fresh batch of mash, heavier on the goldenrod, and she fed the survivors with her own hands. The frost had taken 2 birds, but it had not taken her system, and it had not taken her conviction. The summer that followed was the hottest anyone in Millhaven could remember. The creek dropped to a trickle by July. The grass yellowed and then browned. The corn in the big fields stood stunted and sad, leaves curling inward like hands clutching something precious. The cattle grew thin and restless, and the chickens of every other farm in the county began to sicken. The summer that followed was the hottest anyone in Millhaven could remember. The creek dropped to a trickle by July. The grass yellowed and then browned. The corn in the big fields stood stunted and sad, leaves curling inward like hands clutching something precious. The cattle grew thin and restless, and the chickens of every other farm in the county began to sicken. It started with the Marsh flock. Delbert Marsh had 53 birds at the beginning of June, a respectable number for a man who claimed not to fuss over poultry. By the first week of July, he had lost 11. They stopped eating, then stopped moving, then stopped breathing. He found them in the mornings, stiff and cold, with no obvious wound and no explanation. He blamed the heat. He blamed the water. He blamed the feed. He did not blame himself because Delbert Marsh had never learned the habit of looking inward when something went wrong. But the truth, which Sarah saw clearly from the careful observations of her own small flock, was that Marsh's birds had been weakened by months of ordinary neglect. Not cruelty, not intentional harm, but the kind of neglect that comes from assuming that things will take care of themselves if you just leave them alone. His birds drank from a trough that had not been cleaned since the previous autumn. They ate the same corn mash day after day, no variation, no supplement, no thought given to what the heat was doing to their systems. When the temperature climbed past 100, their bodies had nothing to draw on. They had been surviving, not thriving, and surviving could only take a creature so far. The sickness spread, not the way a plague spreads, with dramatic speed and visible horror, but the way a slow leak spreads through a hull, unnoticed until the ship is already listing. The Alden flock began to thin. The widow who had sold Sarah the pullets wrote a letter saying that her remaining birds were listless and that she was thinking of giving up entirely. The feed store clerk mentioned in passing that he had never seen so many farmers complaining about their poultry in a single season. And all the while, Sarah's birds moved through the heat with a steadiness that seemed almost unnatural. She had prepared for this, though she had not known she was preparing. The herbs she had been adding to the mash since winter were not just flavoring. The goldenrod, the thyme, the yarrow, the clover, each one contained something that helped a bird regulate its body temperature, maintain its appetite, fight off the infections that flourished in stagnant water and dirty bedding. She had not known the science. She had known only that her grandmother's chickens had been healthier than anyone else's, and that her grandmother had grown those same herbs in a patch beside the kitchen door. She was learning now that the old knowledge was not superstition. It was observation, repeated so many times that it became habit, and then tradition, and then something that looked like magic to people who had forgotten how to pay attention. She began to receive visitors, not the curious ones who had come in the spring, drawn by the novelty of her fried chicken. These were different. They came with worried faces and hats twisted in their hands. They came to ask what she was doing, how she was keeping her birds alive while theirs were dying. The first one was a young farmer named Elias Porter, who had taken up a claim south of the creek 2 years before, and had not yet learned to hide the desperation in his voice. He stood at her gate and said he had heard she knew something about chickens. He said he had lost 7 birds in the past 2 weeks and could not afford to lose any more. Sarah listened. She asked him what he was feeding them. He told her. She asked him what he was giving them to drink and how often he changed it. He told her that too, and she could see in his face that he already knew the answer was not good enough. She walked with him to his claim later that afternoon, a thing she had never done before, a thing that would be noticed and talked about and added to the ledger of her reputation. She looked at his pen, at his water trough, at the pale, standing corn mash in his feed bin. She did not tell him everything. She did not give away the full recipe because she was not a fool and because the knowledge she had built was the only thing standing between her family and the same poverty that had brought her to Harkin's gate with 12 cents in her pocket. But she told him 3 things. Clean water twice a day, not once. A handful of dried thyme crumbled into the mash. And shade, real shade, not just the shadow of the barn, but a low canopy of burlap or canvas that let the air move underneath. He wrote it down on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil. He thanked her 3 times, the way a man thanks someone when he is not sure the thanks is enough. She walked home in the late afternoon heat, the prairie shimmering around her, and she thought about what she had done. She had shared something she had earned through months of work and ridicule. She had given it freely to a man she barely knew, and she did not regret it. Because the frontier was not a place where you could hoard what you knew and still call yourself part of a community. The frontier was a place where knowledge spread the way fire spread, fast, uncontrollable, and sometimes saving the person who passed it on along with the person who received it. Word traveled. By the end of July, she had received 4 more visitors. Each one came with a different story and the same underlying question. How are you doing what everyone else cannot? She answered each one differently, tailoring her advice to what she saw in their pens and their faces. She did not ask for payment. She did not keep a list of who owed her, but she noticed that the mockery had stopped. The Alden boys no longer walked past her gate. Delbert Marsh no longer stopped at the fence line. The feed store clerk met her eyes when she came in for supplies and did not look away first. The summer pressed on. The heat did not break. The creek shrank to a string of muddy pools, and Thomas had to dig the well deeper just to keep the household water flowing. Sarah carried buckets to the lean-to twice a day, not because the chickens could not reach the trough, but because she wanted the water to be cool and fresh and not sitting in the sun. She added mint to the mash now, a handful of dried leaves she had gathered from a patch near the creek before it dried up. She had read somewhere that mint cooled the blood. She did not know if it was true, but her birds were eating it eagerly, and their combs stayed bright even in the 100-degree afternoons, and she counted that as evidence enough. She expanded the ash beds in the lean-to, spreading them wider and deeper than she had in the winter, because she had learned that ash did not just hold warmth, it also absorbed moisture, keeping the bedding dry and discouraging the mites and fungi that flourished in humid heat. She was learning all the time now, not from books, but from the birds themselves. They told her what they needed by the way they moved, the way they held their wings, the way they gathered in certain corners of the pen when the sun was highest. She watched them the way a woman watches a garden, patient and expecting, and they rewarded her attention with health that seemed almost miraculous to the people who came to her gate. By August, the frost that had killed 2 of her pullets in the spring seemed like a distant memory. She had 19 birds now, counting the ones she had raised from the widow's pullets and the ones that had hatched from the eggs she had let the broody hen sit on in June. 4 of the new chicks were roosters, which meant they would grow into meat by autumn. She had already marked them in her ledger, named them in her mind for the purpose they would serve. She was not sentimental about the roosters. The hens were the future. The roosters were the present, and the present was a time of scarcity, when a bird in the hand mattered more than a dozen in the pen. She sold 2 roosters to Elias Porter, whose surviving birds had perked up noticeably after following her advice. He paid her in a bushel of early potatoes and a promise of help with fencing if she ever needed it. She accepted the potatoes and stored the promise in the same part of her mind where she kept the names of people who could be trusted. That was a different kind of ledger, just as important as the one she wrote in ink. The heat finally broke in the 3rd week of August, not gradually but with a thunderstorm that rolled across the prairie like a judgment. The rain came down in sheets, washing the dust from the grass and filling the creek bed in a single afternoon. Sarah stood at the cabin door with Thomas and watched the water run, watched the world turn green again, watched the chickens shake themselves and spread their wings in the cool, damp air. She did not cry, but she felt something close to it, a loosening of a tightness she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. The crisis had passed. Her birds had survived. Her system had proven itself under the worst conditions the summer could throw at it. And the town of Millhaven had begun to look at her differently. But Delbert Marsh had not come to her gate. He had not asked for her advice. He had not acknowledged that she had done what he could not. And Sarah knew, with the same certainty that she knew the mash needed herbs and the water needed changing, that Delbert Marsh was not finished with her yet. A man like that did not change his mind easily. A man like that needed more than a single season of proof. He needed to be shown, in terms he could not dismiss, that what she had built was not luck. She did not have to wait long for that showing. In early September, when the nights had begun to cool and the prairie was recovering from the summer's punishment, a letter arrived at the Millhaven post office addressed to Mrs. Sarah Whitaker. It was from the Territorial Agricultural Board in Lincoln, written on official paper with a seal that meant something even to people who could not read. The letter said that the board had received a report from a Mrs. Whitcomb of Millhaven, attesting to the exceptional quality of poultry raised on the Whitaker homestead. It said that the board was conducting a study of livestock management practices across the Nebraska Territory, and that they would be honored if Mrs. Whitaker would submit a written account of her methods for possible inclusion in their annual report. She read the letter 3 times, standing at the post office counter, while the clerk watched her with an expression she could not quite name. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket, next to her ledger. She walked home without hurrying, because she wanted to feel every step of that walk, wanted to remember the exact weight of that paper in her pocket, wanted to hold the moment close before she shared it with anyone else. Thomas was mending the fence near the road when she came up the path. He saw her face before she said anything, and he straightened slowly, the hammer still in his hand. She pulled out the letter and handed it to him. He read it. He read it again. Then he looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the recognition that hope had been justified. "You did it," he said, and she nodded. She let herself feel it for just a moment, the weight of what she had accomplished, before she turned and walked toward the lean-to to check on the chickens. Because the work was not finished. The acknowledgement from Lincoln was a milestone, but it was not the destination. The destination was a farm that could stand on its own, a flock that could sustain them through any season, a system that could be taught to anyone who was willing to learn. The destination was a life that did not depend on the good opinion of people like Delbert Marsh, and she was closer to that destination than she had ever been, closer than she had dared to imagine on that November afternoon when she had walked home with 11 ragged birds and 12 cents worth of hope. But the frontier does not let a person rest on what they have achieved. It tests them again, in a different way, to see if the first success was a foundation or a peak, and the next test was already gathering itself, like a storm on the far edge of the prairie, waiting for the moment when she would least expect it. She felt it in the air that evening as she closed the ledger and banked the fire for the night. Something was coming. She could not name it yet, but she could feel its weight, pressing against the edge of her awareness the way the north wind presses against a window before it breaks through. She lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around her, and she thought about what she had learned in the past year. She had learned that a woman with 12 cents and a plan could change her life. She had learned that mockery was a kind of wind that could be weathered. She had learned that the old knowledge, passed down through mothers and grandmothers, was not obsolete. It was waiting for someone to prove it true again. She had learned that a ledger, kept honestly and consistently, could show you a future you had not yet imagined. And she had learned that the people who laughed loudest were often the ones who were most afraid of being wrong. She did not know what the autumn would bring. She did not know if Delbert Marsh would ever admit what she had done. She did not know if the board in Lincoln would publish her methods, or if the letter would be the end of it. But she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like warmth from a fire, that she was not the same woman who had walked to Harkin's gate with a cracked coin purse. She was something else now, something that had been tested and had not broken. And that was worth more than any amount of mockery or praise. She closed her eyes and let the night hold her. And in the morning, she would rise before the light and begin again. Because that was what the frontier demanded, and she had learned to meet its demands without fear. The morning after the letter arrived, Sarah rose before the sun and lit the lamp before she had even pulled her boots on. She unfolded the paper from the territorial board and read it one more time by the small flame, letting the words settle into her mind the way water settles into dry ground. Then she placed it in the ledger, between the page where she had recorded the first successful sale and the page where she had noted the summer's survival rates. It belonged there, among the evidence of what careful work could produce. She went about her morning chores with the same steady rhythm she had maintained since November. But there was a new lightness in her movements, a sense that the ground beneath her feet had become a little more solid. She mixed the mash with the usual herbs, added the mint she had dried and crumbled the week before, and carried it to the pen in the gray half-light of early dawn. The chickens came to her without hesitation now, even the ones she had raised from chicks who had never known any other hand. They trusted her. That was not a small thing, she thought, watching them eat. Trust between a woman and her animals was earned in small increments, day after day, through consistency and care. It could not be faked, and it could not be rushed. By mid-morning, word of the letter had reached Millhaven. She knew this because Thomas came back from the mill with a quiet expression and a piece of news that he delivered the way a man delivers something he wishes he did not have to carry. Delbert Marsh had been at the feed store when the postmaster mentioned the letter. Marsh had laughed, the same loud laugh, and said that the territorial board did not know anything about real farming, that they were a bunch of bureaucrats who had never mucked out a chicken coop in their lives, that the letter was probably a mistake or a prank. Then he had said something else, something that Thomas did not repeat at first, but which Sarah saw in the set of his jaw and the way he would not meet her eyes. "What did he say?" she asked. Thomas set down the bag of corn he had been carrying. "He said that if your chickens are so special, they should survive the coming winter the way they survived the summer. He said he would be watching." Sarah nodded slowly. She understood. The challenge had been issued, not directly to her face, but in the public square of the feed store, where it would travel from mouth to mouth until everyone in the county had heard it. Delbert Marsh was betting that she could not do it twice. He was betting that the summer had been luck, that the winter would break her the way it broke so many others. And he was betting that when she failed, the town would remember that he had predicted it all along. She felt the weight of that bet settle onto her shoulders, but it did not feel the way she expected. It did not feel like fear. It felt like the same steady pressure she had felt when she carried the wing-hurt hen inside, when she spread ash on the lean-to floor, when she crumbled herbs into the mash without knowing if they would work. It was the pressure of something that needed to be done, and she had learned that the best way to meet that pressure was to begin. She spent the rest of September preparing. She had learned from the spring frost that winter could come early and without warning, and she was not going to be caught unprepared again. She and Thomas reinforced the lean-to walls with an extra layer of sod bricks, packing the gaps with clay until the structure was as tight as a root cellar. She expanded the ash storage, building a dry bin near the stove where she could collect the cold ash from the firebox and keep it ready for the winter bedding. She dried every herb she could find: thyme, goldenrod, yarrow, mint, clover, even the tough little stalks of prairie sage that grew along the fence line, and hung them in bundles from the cabin rafters until the air inside smelled like a medicine shop. She sorted her flock with the same careful attention she had used the first winter, separating the strong from the recovering, the young from the mature, the calm from the nervous. She knew each bird now, not by name only, but by its habits and its needs. She knew which ones would need extra mash in the coldest months, which ones would benefit from being grouped together for warmth, which ones would cause trouble if they were not watched. The ledger had become a second memory, a record of everything she had learned, and she consulted it every evening before she closed her eyes. But Delbert Marsh was not idle. He had his own preparations to make, and he made them in full view of the town, so that everyone could see what a proper farmer did when winter approached. He bought extra feed by the wagon load. He built a new hen house, larger than the old one, with proper roosts and nesting boxes, and a floor that he boasted would keep out any draft. He hired 2 men to help with the harvest, something Thomas could not afford to do, and he made sure that everyone knew how much he was spending and how well his operation was running. The comparison was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. On one side of the county, the Whitaker homestead, where a woman kept a ledger and fed her chickens dried weeds and banked ash like a common charwoman. On the other side, the Marsh spread, where a man spent proper money on proper supplies and did things the way they had always been done. The town watched and waited. The autumn passed in a long, slow golden light, the kind that made the prairie beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Sarah worked through it without pause, but she also took time to stand at the fence in the evenings and watch the sun go down, because she had learned that rest was not a luxury, but a necessary part of the system. A woman who never stopped working would eventually break, and she could not afford to break. Not now. October came with a hard edge to the air. The first frost arrived on the 15th, light and brief, but it was a warning. Sarah doubled her checks of the lean-to, adjusting the ash beds, making sure the canvas covers were secure. She started adding a small amount of rendered fat to the mash twice a week to help the birds build the layer of insulation they would need for the months ahead. The roosters she had marked for slaughter she processed early, before the cold could thin them, and she traded the meat for a heavy bolt of wool blanket fabric that she cut and sewed into curtains for the lean-to windows. Every small advantage mattered. Every preparation was a stone laid in the wall that would keep the winter out. The trouble began in the second week of November. It started with a report from Elias Porter, who came to her gate with a face drawn tight with worry. He said that 2 of his birds had died overnight, for no reason he could see. He had followed her advice all summer and through the autumn, and his flock had been healthy, but now something was wrong. She asked him what he had been feeding them, what the water looked like, whether he had noticed any change in their behavior. He answered each question carefully, and nothing he described sounded like a mistake. She went to his claim that afternoon to see for herself. The 2 dead birds were thin, but not starved. Their combs were pale, but not shrunken. She could not find any sign of injury or disease. She told Elias to keep feeding them as she had advised, to change the water twice a day, and to let her know if any more died. She walked home with a cold feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something was moving through the county, something she did not understand yet. The next week, 3 more farmers reported losses. The Alden flock, which had been marginal all summer, lost 7 birds in a single night. The widow, who had sold Sarah the pullets, wrote another letter, this one desperate, saying that all but 4 of her remaining birds had perished and she did not know what to do. Sarah went to every farm that asked for her, carrying her ledger and her dried herbs, looking at water troughs and feed bins, and the condition of the birds that still lived. She began to see a pattern. The birds that were dying were the ones that had been fed on plain corn and nothing else, the ones that had been given the same water for days without changing, the ones that had no ash in their bedding and no herbs in their mash. The birds that had followed her system, even partially, were surviving. But even some of those were beginning to show signs of weakness, a droop in the wing, a dullness in the eye, a reluctance to eat. She sat at her table late into the night, the ledger open in front of her, and she traced the pattern with her finger. It was not a disease, she decided. It was a deficiency. The long summer had depleted something in the soil, something that the plain corn did not replace. The herbs she used provided that missing element, but only if they were given consistently and in the right proportions. She had been building her flock's resilience for nearly a year, layering one good practice on top of another, until the birds were strong enough to withstand the weakness that was now spreading through the county. The others had started too late, or not at all. She wrote down everything she had observed, every detail she could remember, and then she wrote a letter to the Territorial Board in Lincoln, describing what she was seeing and asking for any information they might have about similar outbreaks in other parts of the territory. She sent it the next morning with the freighter, and she waited. The cold deepened. The first real snow fell on the 23rd of November, a heavy, wet blanket that covered the prairie in a single night. Sarah woke to a world that had gone silent and white, the kind of silence that only deep snow can bring. She pulled on her coat and boots and waded out to the lean-to, her breath clouding in front of her. The chickens were huddled together in their groups, feathers puffed, but they lifted their heads when she opened the door. The ash beds were warm. The water had not frozen because she had brought it in warm the night before and covered the trough with canvas. She counted them slowly, one by one, all 19. Then she fed them, and she stood for a moment in the falling snow, watching them eat. And she felt something that was not quite triumph, but was close to it. The winter had begun in earnest. And her system was holding. But Delbert Marsh's chickens were not holding. The news reached her through the network of women who passed information along washing lines and at the mercantile counter. Marsh had lost 22 birds in the first week of December. His new henhouse, for all its proper construction and expensive materials, had not prevented the sickness from finding its way inside. He had tried everything: clean water, different feed, a shipment of medicine from Omaha that cost more than most farmers made in a month. Nothing worked. The birds kept dying, and the town, which had watched his preparations with approval, began to watch his losses with a different kind of attention. Sarah heard the reports and felt no satisfaction. She was not glad that Marsh's birds were dying. She would have preferred that no birds died at all. But she could not deny that the evidence was accumulating in her favor. And she knew, with the same certainty that guided her hand when she mixed the mash, that Delbert Marsh would not come to her for help. He would lose every bird he had before he admitted that a woman with 12 cents and a ledger had known something he did not. She was right. By Christmas, Marsh had lost 41 of his 53 birds. The remaining 12 were weak and listless, and the talk in Millhaven had shifted from quiet skepticism to open wonder. People began to say that Sarah Whitaker had some kind of gift. They said it quietly at first, then louder, and then they began to come to her for help in numbers she had not expected. She spent the week between Christmas and New Year's visiting 6 different farms, carrying her dried herbs and her careful instructions, showing people how to mix the mash, how to check the water, how to bank the ash bedding. She did not charge for her time, but she accepted small payments: a jar of preserves, a length of wool, a promise of labor in the spring. She was not building wealth, not yet. She was building something more valuable, a reputation that could not be dismissed or denied. The coldest night of the winter came on the 12th of January. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, a cold so fierce that the wood in the stove cracked and the cabin walls groaned under the strain. Sarah and Thomas worked in shifts through the night, keeping the fire hot, checking the lean-to every 2 hours, bringing warm water to the chickens in covered buckets. They did not sleep. They did not complain. They simply did what needed to be done, the way they had always done it. When the sun finally rose on the morning of the 13th, the world was glittering and still and deadly cold. Sarah walked to the lean-to with her heart tight in her chest. She opened the door. The chickens were alive, all 19 of them. They were huddled together, feathers puffed to twice their normal size, but they were breathing, they were moving, they were alive. She leaned against the doorframe and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She had faced the worst winter anyone in Millhaven could remember, a winter that was killing livestock across the territory, and her birds had survived. Not by luck, not by accident, by design, by the careful, patient, relentless application of everything she had learned. She closed the lean-to door and walked back through the frozen yard toward the cabin, where Thomas was waiting with coffee and a question in his eyes. She nodded once. And he smiled, a slow, rare smile that warmed her more than the fire ever could. The morning after the coldest night, the prairie lay beneath a crust of ice that glittered like shattered glass under the low January sun. Sarah stood at the edge of the lean-to with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of chicory, watching the chickens move slowly across the ash-covered floor. They were stiff, yes, and their movements were cautious, but they were alive, every single one. She counted them twice, the way she counted everything twice, and then she let herself breathe. Thomas came up behind her and stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his coat. He did not say anything, but he did not need to. The fact that they were both standing there, watching a flock of 19 chickens in the worst winter the county had seen in 20 years, said everything that needed to be said. She finished her coffee and went back to work. There was no time to stand and marvel. The winter was not finished with them, and she had preparations to make for the next cold snap. She had learned that the system was not a single solution, but a continuous process of adjustment. The cold was a conversation, and she was learning to speak its language. The second week of January brought another storm, not as cold as the first, but longer, with 3 days of wind that drove the snow into drifts as high as a man's waist. Sarah could not reach the lean-to for nearly 30 hours without wading through snow that came up past her knees. She tied a rope between the cabin door and the pen door, the way Thomas had suggested, so that she could find her way even when the whiteout erased every landmark. She carried warm mash in a covered bucket, the steam rising into the frozen air, and she fed the chickens by feel, her fingers numb inside her gloves. The birds pressed close to her, not in panic but in trust, and she spoke to them in a low, steady voice as she worked. She told them that they were the best birds she had ever known. She told them that the spring would come. She told them that they were going to make it, and she believed every word she said. The storm passed. The sun returned, pale and distant, and the county began to dig itself out. Reports came in slowly, carried by neighbors who had to walk because the roads were impassable. Elias Porter had lost 3 more birds despite his best efforts. The Alden flock was down to 11 from an original 40. The widow who had sold Sarah the pullets had lost all but 2, and those 2 were so weak she did not expect them to last the month. And Delbert Marsh had lost the last of his birds. The final 12 had perished in the 3-day storm. His new henhouse, built with such pride and expense, was empty. Sarah heard the news from the miller's wife, who came to the cabin on the second day of sunshine, her mare picking its way carefully through the frozen ruts. Mrs. Whitcomb sat at the table with a cup of hot tea and delivered the report with the same measured tone she used for everything. "He has nothing left," she said. "Not a single bird. The men he hired have been let go. I heard from the postmaster that he tried to send for medicine from Omaha, but it did not arrive in time." Sarah did not respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, folded on the table, and she thought about the man who had laughed loud enough to be heard from the well. She thought about the way he had stood at her fence line and shaken his head, dismissing her work as foolishness. She thought about the challenge he had issued in the feed store, the bet that she could not do it twice. She had done it twice. She had done it through a summer that killed his birds and a winter that finished the rest, and he had nothing. "Does he know that mine survived?" she asked. Mrs. Whitcomb set down her cup. "Everyone knows, Sarah. The whole county knows. The same people who laughed at you last spring are now telling the story as if they always believed in you." Sarah shook her head slowly. "I do not care about that," she said. "I care about the birds that died. I care about the families who are going to go hungry this winter because they did not have the information they needed in time." Mrs. Whitcomb looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. "You gave them the information," she said. "They chose not to take it." Sarah nodded. She knew that was true, but it did not make the losses any easier to bear. The winter pressed on. Sarah continued her rounds, visiting the farms that had asked for her help, checking on the birds that were still alive, offering advice and dried herbs, and the steady reassurance of someone who had been through the worst and come out the other side. She began to see a change in the way people looked at her. The skepticism had been replaced by something else, something that took her a while to recognize because she had never expected to receive it. It was respect. Not the grudging kind, but the genuine kind, the kind that comes when a person has proven themselves beyond any reasonable doubt. The feed store clerk greeted her by name now, and he asked her opinion on the quality of the grain he was selling. The Alden boys, who had flapped their arms and made chicken noises at her gate, crossed to the other side of the road when they saw her coming, and Delbert Marsh, for all his loss and pride, stayed silent. She saw him once, at the Mercantile, standing near the stove with a group of men. He did not meet her eyes. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked out when she entered, and the men he had been talking to looked at each other and then at her, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. In February, a second letter arrived from the Territorial Board in Lincoln. This one was longer, more formal, written on heavier paper with a seal that seemed to glow in the winter light. The board informed her that her account of poultry management practices had been reviewed and found to be of exceptional value. They requested permission to publish her methods in the upcoming Territorial Agricultural Report, which would be distributed to every county office in Nebraska. They also asked if she would consider traveling to Lincoln in the spring to speak at a conference on livestock management, an invitation that came with an offer to cover her travel expenses. She read the letter aloud to Thomas that evening, standing by the stove with the paper trembling slightly in her hands. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he set down the piece of harness he had been mending and looked at her for a long moment. "You are going," he said. It was not a question. "I am going," she replied. And then she laughed, a sound that surprised her, that came from somewhere deep and had been waiting a long time to come out. She laughed until her sides ached, and Thomas laughed with her, and the chickens outside, hearing the unfamiliar sound, stirred and clucked in the darkness of the lean-to. But the winter was not done with its tests. In the third week of February, a Chinook wind came down off the mountains, bringing a sudden warmth that melted the snow in a matter of days. The ground turned to mud. The creek rose again, flooding the low fields. And then, as quickly as it had come, the warm wind stopped, and the temperature plummeted again, freezing the mud into iron-hard ridges and coating everything in a layer of ice that made walking a danger. Sarah had never seen anything like it. The ice killed 2 of Elias Porter's remaining birds, not through cold, but through the sheer impossibility of moving safely in their pen. She received word that other farms had suffered similar losses, and she watched her own flock with an attention that bordered on obsession, checking the lean-to floor for any sign of moisture, any place where the ice might form. She spread extra straw, extra ash, extra canvas. She adjusted the mash to include a higher proportion of fat to help the birds generate more body heat. She did everything she knew to do, and she prayed that it would be enough. The ice storm lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, the sun rose into a sky of impossible blue, and the world glittered with a cold, cruel beauty that took her breath away. She walked to the lean-to with her heart in her throat. The door was frozen shut. She had to pry it open with a crowbar, the ice cracking and splintering as she worked. Inside, the chickens were huddled in the center of the largest ash bed, pressed together in a single mass of feathers and warmth. They turned their heads toward her when the light came in, and they blinked slowly, as if asking her what had taken so long. She counted them. 17. 2 were missing. She found them in the far corner of the lean-to, where a small leak in the roof had allowed moisture to seep in and freeze around their feet. They had been trapped by the ice, unable to move, and the cold had taken them. She knelt beside them and touched their feathers, already stiff and cold. She had named these birds. She had raised them from pullets, and she had failed to protect them from a weakness in her own preparation. She sat back on her heels and looked up at the roof, at the small gap where the boards had shifted in the freeze. She had not noticed it. She had been so focused on the walls, the bedding, the feed, the water, but she had not thought to check the roof after the Chinook wind. That was the lesson. That was the frontier teaching her something she had not yet learned. A system was never finished. It had to be examined, questioned, improved every single day. She had gotten complacent. She had trusted that what had worked before would continue to work without adjustment, and 2 birds had died because of it. She buried them near the fence line, next to the 2 that had died in the spring frost. She marked the spot with a small stone, and she stood in the cold sunlight and made a promise to herself and to the birds that remained. She would not make that mistake again. She would check the roof every day, even when it seemed fine. She would look for the small weaknesses, the hidden gaps, the places where the system could fail. She would learn from every loss, and she would make sure that the ones who survived benefited from what the ones who died had taught her. Thomas found her there, standing by the graves, and he did not say anything about the loss. He simply stood beside her for a moment, and then he walked to the barn and came back with a ladder. He climbed onto the lean-to roof and began to work on the gap, patting it with fresh sod and clay, making it tighter than it had been before. She watched him work, and she felt the weight of the loss settle into her chest. But she also felt something else. She felt the beginning of a deeper understanding. The system she was building was not just about herbs and ash and mash. It was about attention. Continuous, unbroken, undivided attention to the details that other people overlooked. That was what set her apart from Delbert Marsh. That was what would carry her through the rest of the winter and into the spring. She walked back inside and opened her ledger to the page where she had recorded the winter's events. She drew a line through the final entry, the one that marked the 2 birds as alive, and she wrote their names beneath it with the date of their death. Then she made a new entry at the bottom of the page, in letters that were smaller and more careful than usual. Check the roof every day. The system is never finished. She closed the ledger and set it on the shelf, and she went back to work. The winter had taught her something new, something she would not forget, and the spring, when it came, would find her ready. The days lengthened slowly. The ice retreated. The mud dried. And one morning in early March, Sarah walked out to the lean-to and heard a sound she had been waiting for since November. A hen was singing. Not clucking, not fussing, but singing the low, satisfied song that meant she was about to lay an egg. Sarah stood still and listened. The sound grew, joined by another, and then another, until the lean-to was filled with the soft, contented chorus of birds that were healthy and warm and ready to begin again. She did not rush to collect the eggs. She simply stood in the doorway and let the sound wash over her, the proof that the winter had been survived, that the system had held, that the future was still ahead of her. The first egg was laid on the 8th of March, a pale brown egg with a faint blush of pink along its curve. She held it in her hand, still warm from the hen, and she felt the weight of it as something more than an egg. It was a promise. The winter had done its worst, and she had met it and held her ground. The spring would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to learn. But she would face them the same way she had faced everything else, with a ledger in her pocket and a steady hand, and the quiet certainty that the work was worth doing. She placed the egg in the basket with the same care she had once used to carry a wing-hurt hen home from Harkin's yard. And she smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve at the corner of her mouth, but it was real, and it stayed with her through the rest of the day, through the evening chores, through the night. The winter was ending, and she had won. Spring came to the Powder River country the way a long illness finally lifts, not with a celebration, but with small, almost unnoticed signs. A patch of bare ground appearing where the snow had been, a bird singing at dawn from a branch that had been silent for months, the creek beginning to run again, not with a rush, but with a thin, clear trickle that widened day by day. Sarah watched for these signs the way she watched her chickens, with patient attention that expected nothing and noticed everything. She had survived the winter with 17 birds, and those 17 were now the foundation of something larger than she had planned. The hens had begun laying in earnest, and the eggs were unlike any the county had seen. The yolks were deep orange, almost red in certain light, and the shells were hard and clean. She sold them at the mercantile for twice the price of ordinary eggs, and they were gone within an hour of being placed on the counter. The money went into a tin she kept hidden in the root cellar, and every week she added to it and subtracted nothing. The flood came in late April. It was not a dramatic flood, not the kind that washes away barns and carries cattle downstream. It was a slow, creeping rise of the creek that pushed water into the low fields and sat there, turning the ground to soup and contaminating every well within a quarter-mile of the banks. The water turned brown and foul, carrying silt and the residue of winter rot, and any creature that drank it without boiling it first would sicken within days. The chickens of Millhaven had been weakened by the long winter, and the contaminated water was the final blow. Within a week, farmers who had lost birds to the cold began losing the survivors to a diarrhea that left them hollow and lifeless. The Alden flock, already reduced to 11, dropped to 4. Elias Porter, who had followed Sarah's instructions faithfully through the winter, lost 3 birds despite his best efforts because he had not thought to check his water source after the flood. Sarah's flock did not sicken. She had been boiling their drinking water since the first thaw, not because she knew the flood was coming, but because she had learned that clean water was the foundation of every other practice. It was a lesson she had written in her ledger months before, and she had followed it without exception. When the flood came, her birds were already accustomed to water that had been heated and cooled, and their bodies had built a resistance to the impurities that were killing their neighbors' flocks. She shared the practice freely. She stood at her gate and told every farmer who came that they must boil the water, must cool it completely, must never give their birds a drop from the creek until the ground had dried. Some listened, some did not. Those who listened saved their remaining birds. Those who did not lost them. Delbert Marsh had no birds left to save. His henhouse stood empty, a monument to his pride and his refusal to learn. He had spent the winter in silence, avoiding the mercantile, avoiding the feed store, avoiding any place where he might have to face the neighbors who had watched him fail. Sarah saw him once, from a distance, standing at the edge of his property and looking out across the wet fields with an expression she could not read. She did not approach him. He had not earned that from her. But she did not forget him either. She remembered the laugh. She remembered the challenge. She remembered the way he had stood at her fence line and shaken his head, dismissing the work of her hands as foolishness. And she knew that the reckoning would come, not because she demanded it, but because the truth demanded it. It came on the first Saturday of May, a morning so clear and warm that it felt like an apology from the sky for the winter that had passed. Sarah was in the lean-to, collecting eggs, when she heard a sound she had not expected, the heavy tread of boots crossing the yard, and Thomas's voice, low and careful, saying something she could not hear. She set down the basket and walked to the door. Delbert Marsh stood at the gate. He was not wearing the good coat he had worn when he passed judgment on her flock. He was wearing an old work shirt, stained and frayed at the collar, and his hands hung at his sides with the empty look of a man who did not know what to do with them. He looked older than he had a year ago, older and smaller, as if the winter had taken something from him that would not grow back. He saw her coming, and he did not move. He waited, the way a man waits when he knows he has no right to hurry. She walked to the gate and stopped on her side of it. He did not speak. He looked at her, and then he looked past her, at the lean-to where the chickens moved in the morning light, at the neat pen she had built and maintained, at the garden she had planted along the south wall of the cabin. He looked at all of it for a long moment, and then he said her name, Mrs. Whitaker. His voice was rough, the voice of a man with dust in his throat. "I have come to say something that I should have said a long time ago." She waited. He took a breath, the kind of breath a man takes before he does something he has never done before. "I was wrong," he said. "I laughed at you. I told everyone in town that you were wasting your time. I said that a woman with a ledger and a handful of weeds could not do what experienced farmers could not do. I was wrong." He said it again, as if the words needed to be spoken twice to be believed. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Whitaker. You have done what no one else in this county has done. You have kept your birds alive through the worst season any of us can remember. And I have nothing left. Not a single bird. Not a single egg. Nothing." He stopped, and she saw his hands tremble slightly at his sides. "I am not asking for charity. I am not asking for my birds back. I am asking if you will teach me what you know. I am asking if you will show me how to start again, the right way." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the laugh she had heard from the well. She thought about the remarks at the feed store, the snickers from the Alden boys, the way the town had watched her with skeptical eyes while she carried her mash pail and her ledger and her quiet, stubborn hope. She thought about the wing-hurt hen and the ash beds and the long nights when she had doubted herself but kept working anyway. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, standing at her own gate, with a man who had mocked her asking to learn from her. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt something simpler and more important. She felt the weight of what she had built, and she understood that it was not meant to be kept to herself. "I will teach you," she said, "but you will follow my instructions exactly, without changing them to suit your own ideas. You will keep a ledger. You will boil the water. You will use the herbs I tell you to use, and you will not laugh at what you do not understand." He nodded. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he has finally understood what he should have known all along. She opened the gate and let him into the yard. She walked him to the lean-to and showed him the ash beds, the canvas covers, the divided sections for birds of different temperaments. She opened her ledger and showed him the columns, cost, condition, change, and she explained why she kept it, how she used it, what it had taught her. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "I will start tomorrow," and then he turned and walked back through the gate and across the road toward his empty farm. She watched him go, and she knew that he would keep his word. Not because he was a good man, she was not sure that he was, but because he had been broken by the winter, and broken men sometimes learn what proud men cannot. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Sarah's life. The letter from the Territorial Board had been published, and farmers from 3 counties began to arrive at her gate, asking for advice, asking for birds, asking for the recipe that had saved her flock. She sold pullets at a fair price and gave away the knowledge that made them valuable. She taught classes in her own yard, standing in the spring sunshine with her ledger in her hand, explaining the principles she had learned through trial and error and attention. The women came. The men came too, though some of them stood at the back and said little, as if they were not sure they should be there. She did not mind. She taught anyone who was willing to learn, and she did not ask about their past opinions. The reputation that had once been mockery became something else. People began to call her the Chicken Woman, but they said it with respect now, the way you say a name that carries weight. The miller's wife commissioned a portrait of Sarah to hang in the Mercantile, a small watercolor that caught the way she stood with her hands on her hips, looking out across her yard with steady eyes. Sarah did not know what to make of the portrait. She was not comfortable being the subject of attention, but she understood that it mattered to the town, and so she accepted it with the same quiet grace she accepted everything. The harvest that autumn was the best the Whitaker homestead had ever seen. The herbs she had planted in the spring had grown thick and fragrant along the fence line, and she had dried enough to last through 2 winters. The flock had grown to 43 birds, and she had sold enough eggs and meat to pay off the debt on the claim and put a substantial sum into the tin in the root cellar. Thomas had built a second pen, larger than the first, and they were already planning to expand again in the spring. Delbert Marsh came by once a week to show her his ledger. He had started with 6 pullets she had sold him, and he had lost only 1. He followed her instructions with the devotion of a man who had learned his lesson in the hardest possible way. He did not laugh anymore. He did not boast. He simply worked, and she respected him for that, even if she did not like him. On a cool evening in late October, when the leaves had turned and the prairie was gold and quiet, she sat on the step of the cabin with her ledger open in her lap. Thomas was inside, building a fire against the coming chill. The chickens were settling into their pens for the night, making the soft, contented sounds that meant they were safe and warm. She looked at the columns of numbers in the ledger, the record of a year that had changed everything. The cost column was long, filled with the price of corn and salt and herbs, and the 12 cents that had started it all. The condition column was longer, full of notes about feathers and feet and the color of combs. And the change column ran all the way to the bottom of the page, dense with evidence of transformation. She closed the book and held it against her chest for a moment. And then she reached into the basket beside her and lifted out the single egg that had been laid that morning, still warm from the hen. She held it in her palm, turning it slowly in the fading light, feeling its weight and its warmth and its promise. It was the same kind of egg she had held on the 8th of March, the first egg of the spring. But this was the last egg of the autumn, the end of a cycle that had brought her full circle. She thought about the wing-hurt hen, wrapped in feed sack and tucked into the ash box near the stove. She thought about the cold mornings and the long nights and the sound of laughter carried on the prairie wind. She thought about the ledger, the constant companion of her journey. And she thought about the small, pale egg in her hand, the evidence of a system that worked. She held it up to the last light of the sun, and she smiled. Then she placed it carefully back in the basket, stood up, and walked inside to join her husband by the fire. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.